In 900 CE, the engineers who built the most sophisticated water system in the ancient Americas watched their cisterns run dry. Not because of drought, because of what they had built to survive it. The white plaster coating every plaza, every temple, every palace wall. The exact recipe that stored their water had quietly, systematically destroyed the mechanism that produced the rain in the first place. This is the story of how they built themselves out of existence. Now, here's the thing about the Maya that most people get wrong. They weren't a civilization that ran out of resources because they were careless. They weren't ignorant. They weren't even unlucky. Every massive stone plaza you see in these cities, every gleaming white courtyard stretching hundreds of meters across the hilltops, is not just a monument to power. It is a machine, a water machine. Coated in thick white limestone plaster, these platforms are precision-engineered funnels. Every drop of rainfall channels along carved stone gutters into underground cisterns, large enough to sustain tens of thousands of people through months without a single cloud in the sky. It is one of the most elegant infrastructure solutions in the ancient world, and it is going to kill them. Because the recipe for that white plaster, the chemical process coating every surface, every wall, every courtyard, required something the engineers had in seemingly limitless supply: the jungle. And the jungle was not limitless. By 900 CE, dozens of great cities across the southern Maya lowlands were being abandoned. The rains had failed. The cisterns were empty. The plazas, still gleaming white, stood in the center of a landscape that looked nothing like a jungle anymore. What destroyed them was not war, not disease, not some sudden catastrophe you can circle on a calendar. It was chemistry, and this is that story. Most great civilizations are defined by what they were given. The Maya were defined by what they weren't. No rivers at the surface, no permanent lakes, no reliable groundwater in the limestone lowlands where the greatest cities stood. Every other major ancient empire built itself along a river. The Maya built on a dry limestone plateau and bet everything on 6 months of sky. When the sky cooperated, it worked. When the sky stopped cooperating, for reasons they had helped create, there was no fallback, so they engineered the sky's output directly. The Stucco plaza system was the answer. Enormous stone platforms, leveled with extraordinary precision, coated in thick, polished white lime plaster. During the wet season, water shed off these angled surfaces along carved channels and drained into the underground cisterns, chultuns, hand-carved into the limestone bedrock beneath the city. It worked. For centuries, it worked brilliantly. Cities like Tikal, Caracol, and Copan housed populations that should have been hydrologically impossible for their geography. These were cities with no right to exist, and they existed anyway for generations because the engineering was that good. But the stucco had a cost that no one fully calculated at scale. To produce 1 single ton of lime plaster, Maya engineers had to burn approximately 20 tons of freshly cut green wood in massive open kilns. 20 to 1. 1 ton of white waterproof coating for every 20 tons of living forest. And this is where the numbers stop being abstract. Tikal, at its peak, required enough stucco to coat the equivalent of 40 modern football fields of architecture. Temples, plazas, causeways, palace facades, all of it white, all of it maintained, and recoated every few years as the tropical humidity eroded the surface. Run that math. 800 tons of forest, gone, for 1 city's plaster, in a single generation. And Tikal was not alone. At peak, there were over 40 major cities in the southern lowlands, each competing to build taller, wider, whiter. Here is the question no one asked loudly enough. What does burning 20 tons of green jungle per ton of plaster do, not to the forest, but to the air above it? That answer doesn't come from chemistry. It comes from meteorology. And we call that a cautionary tale when it happens to someone else. When it happens to us, We call it an unexpected consequence. It didn't arrive until the damage was already done. To understand what the Maya were actually destroying, you need to understand what a mature tropical forest does. Not what it looks like, what it does. A tropical canopy, like the Maya lowlands, doesn't just hold carbon and provide shade. It manufactures weather. Every single day, through a process called evapotranspiration, a healthy jungle canopy releases billions of gallons of water vapor into the atmosphere. The trees pull moisture up through their roots, filter it through their leaves, and exhale it as invisible vapor into the air above. That vapor rises. It cools. It condenses. It becomes clouds. It becomes rain. The forest is not sitting under the weather cycle. It is the weather cycle. Cut it down, and you don't just lose shade and carbon storage. You break the mechanism that generates rainfall. Paleoclimatologists drilling sediment cores from lakes across the Yucatan found this pattern locked in the geology. Beginning around 800 CE, as deforestation accelerated across the southern lowlands, the regional moisture cycle began to shift. Dry seasons grew longer. The wet season shortened. Rainfall became erratic in exactly the areas where construction was most intense. The correlation is not coincidental, it is causal. And here's the second mechanism, the one that made everything worse: albedo. Albedo is the measure of how much solar radiation a surface reflects back into the atmosphere instead of absorbing it. Dark green jungle canopy has low albedo. It absorbs solar energy, heats the air, and drives the convective currents that pull moisture upward into storm clouds. Bare limestone bedrock has high albedo. Gleaming white stucco plazas have very high albedo. They reflect sunlight back upward. They don't heat the air above them. They don't drive convection. They don't pull moisture into the sky. And here is the engineering irony that should be carved into the entrance of every engineering school on Earth. The plazas were built white specifically to reflect sunlight, to keep the cisterns cool, to reduce evaporation, to preserve every drop of captured water. That was the design intent. They were reflecting solar radiation away from a landscape that desperately needed that energy to drive moisture upward into rain clouds. The very property that made stucco brilliant at preserving water, its blinding whiteness, was actively suppressing the atmospheric conditions required to produce the water it was designed to catch. The system was consuming itself, and no one in 820 CE had the vocabulary to explain why the wet season kept arriving a little later, lasting a little shorter, delivering a little less. By 850 CE, the pattern was undeniable and completely misunderstood. The cisterns were failing. The oral histories said the rains had always come. The engineers had built correctly. The channels worked. The plazas worked. The system was flawless. So they did the only thing a Maya ruler could logically do in a crisis of legitimacy. They built more. In periods of stress, Maya rulers responded with monumental construction, more temples, wider plazas, taller facades, monuments that demonstrated divine favor, engineering mastery, political permanence, more stucco, more wood burned. This is the feedback loop that makes the Maya collapse genuinely terrifying as an engineering case study. The response to water scarcity, building more and better water infrastructure, required burning more wood. Burning more wood required clearing more forest. Clearing more forest weakened the rainfall cycle. Weakening the rainfall cycle worsened the water scarcity, which triggered more monumental construction. Each attempted solution made the underlying problem structurally worse. The feedback loop operated over decades, too slow for any single ruler's lifetime to fully perceive, too slow to recognize, too slow to escape. This is not a story about a civilization that didn't know better. This is a story about a civilization that was doing exactly what its best engineers prescribed, right up until the moment it collapsed. Sound familiar? Paleoclimatic evidence from lake sediments, speleothems, and pollen records across the Yucatan confirms what happened next. Between approximately 820 and 19 CE, the southern lowlands experienced a series of severe, prolonged droughts. Not the natural 6-month dry seasons the cistern system was engineered to absorb. Something categorically different, multi-year failures of the wet season itself. Droughts the engineering had never been designed to withstand because the engineering had helped create them. The cisterns sat perfect and empty. The plazas sat perfect and dry. The channels sat perfect and idle. The entire water system, one of the most sophisticated in the ancient world, was operationally flawless and completely useless because the input it was designed to capture had been engineered out of existence. Between 800 and 950 CE, an estimated 90% of the population of the southern Maya lowlands abandoned their cities through migration, displacement, and attrition over roughly a century. The cities were not sacked, they were not burned, they were not buried, they were simply left. Picture a stonemason in Copan in 830 CE. His job is to resurface the East Plaza. He has done this every 3 years for his entire adult life. It is skilled work, mixing the lime correctly, applying it in layers, burnishing the surface to a finish that would reflect sunlight like still water. This time, the dry season stretches past its usual end. He resurfaces the plaza anyway. No one asks why the cistern beneath it is only half full. No one connects the kiln smoke rising outside the city walls to the clouds that aren't forming above them. He finishes the job. The white plaster gleams. It is the last recorded resurface at Copan. The next layer of stucco never comes. At Tikal, at Caracol, at Palenque, the same archaeological signature, city by city. Construction stops, mid-project in some cases, monuments half-finished, scaffolding never removed. Administrative records end. The last carved date stele in many cities cluster in the early 800s. Then, silence. The jungle, after decades of systematic clearing, began reclaiming the stone. Roots found the mortar joints. Canopies spread back across the plazas. The forest returned, slowly, over generations, to the places where it had been burned for plaster. And this is where it gets strange. The stucco didn't go anywhere. In a jungle that reclaims everything, stone, bone, ceramic, wood, the white plaster coating the abandoned plazas resisted for centuries. The forest came back. The stucco stayed. What does it mean when the instrument of a civilization's collapse outlasts the civilization itself? Some cities held on longer, experimenting with deeper cisterns, expanded collection surfaces, modified drainage systems. None of it solved the problem, because none of it could address the source. Long after the last family had walked north toward the cenotes of the Yucatan, where groundwater surfaced naturally from the limestone aquifer, independent of rainfall, the white plaster remained on. The abandoned plazas, faded, cracked, threaded through with roots, still reflecting sunlight back into a sky that was finally, slowly, over centuries learning to rain again. Historians frame the Maya collapse as a warning for the future. That framing is comfortable because it keeps the lesson safely in the past. It isn't in the past. The feedback loop the Maya built is not a historical artifact. It is an operating mode, one that shows up whenever a civilization optimizes a solution past the point where the solution begins consuming the system that makes it possible. The stucco plaza system was not a mistake. It was one of the most sophisticated hydrological engineering solutions in the pre-Columbian world. It worked for centuries. It sustained cities with no right to exist, on a porous limestone plateau, in a jungle with no rivers, no lakes, no natural water infrastructure beyond the sky itself. But it was optimized for a stable environment. and it was destroying that stability faster than anyone could observe it happening. There's a technical term for what the Maya built, a resource infrastructure feedback loop. You need a resource to build the infrastructure. The infrastructure consumes more of the resource as it scales. The consumption rate eventually exceeds the system's regeneration rate. The infrastructure, still technically functional, still perfectly engineered, becomes operationally useless in the changed environment it helped create. The system collapses. We've encountered versions of this loop throughout history. We continue to encounter it. The names change, the geography changes, the mechanism does not. The Maya engineers asked exactly the right question for their immediate problem. How do we catch the water when it falls? What they didn't ask, what no civilization tends to ask until it's too late, is the deeper question underneath it. What are we doing to the conditions that make it fall? That question is harder. It requires seeing a city not as an object sitting inside a landscape, but as a process that continuously changes the landscape around it. It requires measuring not just what you're building, but what your building is doing to the system you depend on. The Maya built in plaster. The answer was written in the clouds above them. They never learned to read it. The ruins of the great Maya cities are still there. Most of them still carry fragments of white limestone plaster, faded, fractured, pulled apart by roots over centuries but present. Embedded in the stone, like a chemical memory, the jungle hasn't been able to fully erase. If you stand in the great plaza at Tikal at dawn, when the mist is still in the canopy and the forest has reclaimed everything beyond the cleared archaeological zone, you can still see where the stucco was. The stone remembers. The Maya didn't collapse because they made a catastrophic mistake. They collapsed because they made a brilliant solution and scaled it faithfully, completely, for centuries, without being able to see what it was doing to the system that made it viable. This is not a story about ignorance. It's a story about the limits of local knowledge in a system with consequences that reach far beyond the city walls. They could measure a cistern. They could not measure the sky. The forest came back, eventually. The rains came back, eventually. The civilization that engineered one of the most elegant water systems in the ancient world, the one that solved the seemingly impossible problem of sustaining cities with no rivers, never did. Death by Stucco. Not dramatic, not sudden, not violent. A slow, chemical, ecological unraveling, built, burned, mixed and applied, 1 ton of lime plaster and 20 tons of living forest at a time. If the hidden systems behind history's greatest collapses are what you're here for, this channel exists for exactly that reason. Consider subscribing. There's a great deal more where this came from.